Okay, now we're on to chapter 9. We're continuing our fine arts media, and this time we're talking about painting. So, like drawing, we talked about this earlier before the Renaissance, painting was also considered to be a mechanical art. It was just like people thought that artists were just copying things, copying nature. Like drawing, painting is really, really ancient. This is, I believe, a 70,000-year-old image. And where the hands are, what they would do is they would take a piece of hollow bone or bamboo or some kind of reed that was hollow, and they would fill it with pigment, wet pigment, and then they put their hands down and they blow that pigment around their hand. And the marks on here have been painted. Painting surfaces, just like that cave wall, are often porous. So what I mean by porous, that means that they soak up water. They can retain moisture. And that's not a good thing when you're painting. Like, these painting surfaces can include fabric, or there should be a comma there, canvas, wood, masonry walls. They're all porous. And so what artists have to do to solve that problem is they have to apply a ground to seal the surface, such as gesso or sizing, which is starch, or plaster. And then they seal the surface and let it dry, and then they paint on top of that. With paper, they use sizing, and with canvas, they use gesso, and with masonry walls, a lot of times they'll use kilns or they'll use plaster, but all three achieve the same purpose of making the surface like less porous. It seals the surface. So in order to make paint more pliable, a solvent has to be added to it, which we also call medium. And that solvent can be turpentine, linseed oil, gel medium, or water, depending on what the painting medium is. So now we're going to talk about the different kinds of painting media. So medium's the singular, media is the plural. So the first one is encaustic. So encaustic, it's heated wax mixed with ground pigment, and it's usually applied to a wooden panel. So the history of this is, in Greece, they had wooden boats, and they needed to seal them. Needed to make them watertight, so they sealed them with wax. They heat up wax and they'd seal them. But then people always want to embellish things. They always want to decorate things. So they started mixing that wax with pigment so that they could do these colorful paintings on their boats. And the word encaustic comes from a Greek word, enkaustikos, which means to burn in. And it allows you to apply these really thin layers of color to create realistic skin tones and realistic shadows. And one really famous example of using encaustic are what are known as Fayum mummy portraits. This painting of this woman is one of these. So in Egypt had at one point been Greek and Roman colonies, and the Greeks called Al-Fayum, Egypt, they called it Crocodipolis, because in part because people revered crocodiles, and they would keep them in court. They're really dangerous, but they would put necklaces and jewelry on them, and they consider them to be gods. So these Fayum mummy portraits, these are done on wood, and they've probably they're sealed with wax, and then they're painted with this encaustic, this wax and pigments. And people would have these painted like sometimes well before they died. They would, you know, like they might die when they're really old, but they want to still look young and beautiful. So they would have these painted, and this tradition comes from a combination of Greek portrait busts that a lot of times, Greek and Roman ones, a lot of times would be made after someone died and they represented the ancestor, and they would be brought out during important occasions. And these are like kind of blended with the wooden masks that would go into the sarcophagus of the dead. And these are like, they're so beautiful. What I love about these, because even though they're really old, they are individualized. They're not generalized. Like this is generalized. Like we don't know what this person really looked like. But these people, we get a real feeling of what they look like. And if you want to see one of these, when we're allowed to go to places like museums again, go to the Menil collection, and they have one of these, and it's just, I just find these so beautiful and lovely. It's almost like you in a way you get to know people from an ancient time as real individuals. So here's an example like of this melted wax, and they would mix it with the pigment, and the painter keeps this like heated so it's melted while they're painting. Like they'll dip their brush in there and then paint on the canvas or the wood. The next kind of painting form we're going to talk about is fresco, and this is really ancient. Fresco comes from Latin. It means fresh. This is a method of painting on plaster that's been applied to stone or a masonry surface. Again, the plaster is applied to the stone, the cave wall, the masonry, in order to seal it. So then the paint's not sucked up into the porous surface. So this is an ancient painting method, and there's two kinds of fresco we're going to talk about. The first one is buon fresco, which means good fresco. So when the artist is painting using this method, what they would do is they would apply wet plaster to a section of the wall, not the whole wall, it's a section that they knew that they could paint on before it dried. And they would apply the pigment to the wet plaster, and a chemical process happens where the pigment bonds with and into the plaster. So it becomes one with the wall. And the great thing about these buon frescoes, like this is a several thousand-year-old Roman fresco, is that the colors still look almost as fresh as the day it was painted. Buon fresco lasts a lot longer and retains the colors a lot longer than the next fresco method we're going to talk about. So the next fresco method is called fresco secco, dry fresco. This is like a fairly new fresco secco, so the colors are still good, but just imagine if this was 1,000 years old. So what they do in this case is they cover the whole wall in plaster, let it dry, and then paint on top of it with pigment, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes mixed with milk. And so that the fresco, the painting, is only on top of the surface of the wall and not bonded with the plaster in the wall. Now the issue with fresco secco is over time, the paint can crack and peel off the surface more readily. So the colors don't retain their freshness, and the paintings start fading and looking damaged. And so frescoes are found in almost every culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite. I've never been there, and I'm dying to go there. Is the Scrovegni or Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy, and it's by an artist that when I was younger, totally, I was so in love with his work and inspired by his work. I would also often like borrow imagery from it in my paintings. And this artist's name was Giotto de Bondone. Um, this was done around 1305, and it was commissioned by a banker, a moneylender named Enrico Scrovegni. So money lending or usury was considered sinful by Christians and Muslims, and a lot of times they would have Jewish people be the money lenders because the Christians and Muslims, they couldn't do it. It's against their religion. So this guy, I don't know if he was Jewish or not, but Enrico Scrovegni wanted to pay for his sins. So, and he might have been a converso. That was somebody that was a lot of times forced to convert from Judaism to Christianity during the period of the Inquisition, or like sometimes people would just convert because they wanted to. And he had this little small chapel painted by Giotto with all these amazingly beautiful images, and it's dedicated to the Santa Maria della Carita. And I'm like, I'll show you a couple of these. And this is just when people are learning about perspective. And it was also the time when churches were putting on passion plays. So these would be plays on stage. I think about the Passion of Christ. So a lot of times, so the stages, they're not very deep. And so the way he did these paintings, it's almost like these are the theatrical settings where there's not a lot of deep space. And Giotto's known, I may have talked about him earlier, but he's known as one of the first artists at this time that really expressed like real human emotion and angel emotion in his paintings. Like you can feel the grief and pain of the people when they remove Christ from the cross here, and the angels are like crying. So this is like image of a passion play. The stage is really shallow, and these paintings that Giotto did for the Scrovegni chapel, they're also set like this, where there's not really deep space. So these are examples of these real grieving emotions on these people's faces. So they're these very real human emotions, whereas before, paintings were like, like painted, like what painters would do is they would copy other artists' work. So Cimabue right here is kind of copying, or like, I'm sorry, Duccio's copying Cimabue. So you kind of get like, there's not a lot of deep emotion. And then Giotto, he starts, like maybe he's copying somewhat, but he starts kind of adding his own flavor to things. I love his work. I know I already said that 50 times. So the next is tempera. You painted with tempera in elementary school, and everyone's paintings, no matter how much you love your child, with that tempera paint they give you in school, they all look like crap. But this is a different kind of tempera. This is made from ground pigment, egg yolk, and then something to hold that together, a binding agent, and that could be gum arabic, animal glue, or casein, and a solvent, which could be water, milk, or vodka. And it's not the same kind of tempera you use in grade school. And in the chapter, I go into great detail about how these tempera pieces were prepared. A lot of times they're on wood, or they can be on paper. But the ones on wood, there's this long process of preparing them. And with temper, you can't really blend it like you can with oil paint. You have to layer details, one on top of the other. These are two really beautiful egg tempers on panel. And like, again, you have to like, you're having to do little tiny details with a brush, because you can't blend the paint, making it go, like when we talked about gradual contrast and chiaroscuro, you can't blend the paint the same way. You have to like do all of that detail by detail by detail. So like this little painting right here, this is like an icon, a religious icon. And an icon is a small painting in size. They depict Christ or other religious figures or illustrations from the Bible or religious text. And in the chapter, there's an example of how they painted Byzantine icons, and that word Byzantine refers to the Eastern Orthodox Church / the Byzantine Empire. Oh, look, I forgot. I did include this on here. So first you have a board, then the board's covered in clay, then the clay is covered in like a lot of times linen and rabbit skin glue, and then the drawing is sketched into it. Then where the clay is, gold leaf is applied to it. Then the painting itself is layered, like as you get more and more details to make it look more and more realistic. Well, it's not really realistic looking. It's kind of abstract. This is Nestor Topci. He's an artist that paints modern icons. And this painting right here, he asked artists, like, who's your favorite artist? Like, who would you like to have your portrait painted with? And I said, Sofonisba Anguissola, who was a Baroque artist. We talked about her when we talked about, no, we didn't. We talked about Anguissola Gentileschi, but it's like the same period of time. But I love Sofonisa Anguissola because all her paintings of kids look like real kids. So Nestor painted a little icon with me in it. This is David McGee, another Houston artist, really great artist, who talks like he's in a 1950s jazz film with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., and he always calls drinks cocktails. So then the next is oil paint. We talked about it a little bit in an earlier chapter, and it's ground pigment and oil that is either animal or plant-based, and it's mixed with linseed oil as a solvent. And the first known use of it is in Afghanistan in the 7th century. And then in the Middle Ages, they started taking pigment and olive oil to make an oil paint, but it was too thick. It made the paint all look dark, and it took too long to dry. So they started trying to use other kinds of oils like refined linseed oil. And by this time, the 1300s, that refinement of the linseed oil and other oils, they got it perfected, and the paint's still slow to dry, but dried faster. It's lighter in tone, and you could make these are details from a painting of the Ghent altarpiece, but amazing details, light reflections. You can get all these visual textures. You can also use oil in abstract and non-representational modes of expression. Obviously, this is non-representational, non-objective. This is abstract. I wanted to put in this really important piece by Titus Kapar. This is on the, like, today is July 20, oh no, actually today in real life is July 6th, and this was on this week's most recent cover of Time magazine. It's in honor of the death, the murder of George Floyd. It's by this really great artist. I have a little video of him this week, Titus Kaphar, and it's called Analogous Colors. And it's well on canvas. And what he's done in the real painting, he has cut out the baby, because the baby represents all these mothers, the loss of their child due to systematic racism. And he says, Titus Kaphar says it represents all the Black mothers who are unseen and rendered helpless in their fury at the loss of their child. And around this are the names of just a handful of the many, many people that have lost their lives because of systematic violence. It's got the name of 35 men and women, including Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland. So the next type of pigment, watercolor, the next kind of painting medium is watercolor. This is ground pigment and gum arabic, or like a synthetic glycol binding agent, which glycol, I have no idea what that means. And the solvent for watercolor is water. And there's two kinds of watercolor. There's a transparent watercolor, and there's gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. So when you apply transparent watercolor, there's a couple of methods. These are not the only methods, but there's glazing. You put down a thin layer of one color, you let it completely dry, and then you put thin layers of color on top of that. And when you do this, like, you're careful not to overbrush, and it's just like you take your brush and you just start at the top and go to the bottom, and then you don't brush anymore. And then with the yellow, you take your brush and you go here and you brush all the way across, and you don't brush back and forth. And that way you blend the two colors, but you maintain the cleanness, the purity of your other colors, and those underlayers shine through. Then there's charging, and that's when you, instead of letting it dry, you do wet on wet. So in this one, I'm guessing that the person first painted the sky, and then quickly, but not underneath here, just around here, just anywhere you see yellow, that's what they painted, the sky and the water. And then they followed that up by wet this bluish paint, and they let the bluish paint bleed into the wet yellow paint. This is hard to control sometimes, but you can figure it out. You're smart. So watercolor also is really ancient, but in the modern sense, it developed in the East, and like Japan and China. And it wasn't until 1846 that Winsor Newton starts manufacturing tubes of paint, which before the artist would have to grind the pigment, and then they'd have to add the gum arabic to it, and then they'd have to, it was like laborious. And so artists started loving this, and artists that like to paint outside, en plein air painters, have the best French accent ever. They would take tubes of watercolor, and it just made their life so easy because they're not having to grind and mix paint. So one of my favorite watercolor artists is Winslow Homer. And with watercolor, so I bet you watercolored in this class, but watercolor, to achieve really great watercolors, you got to use thick paper. So they make this 300-pound cold press or hot press paper. Cold press is better for watercolor. And then you got to use good brushes. So the thick paper, the nice thing about it, so what Winslow Homer would do is a lot of times where there's little areas of white, he'd take a razor blade or something and after he painted, he scrape back down to the paper. If you do that on 140 pounds, you're going to scrape all the way through the paper. But this 300-pound watercolor paper, it lets you beat the hell out of it. This is John Singer Sargent watercolor. So in India and Persia, the paintings were done either with egg tempera, we talked about that before, or gouache. And gouache is that opaque version of watercolor. So with gouache, it's not meant to be put down where it's really thin. Like watercolor is supposed, when you use watercolor, regular watercolor, it's supposed to be thin enough that the white of the paper shows through. Like with regular watercolor, if you want light blue, you don't mix blue and white. You make really transparent blue to get the light blue, and because you let the paper be the white. With gouache is meant to be opaque. So if you want light blue, you mix light blue you mix blue and white gouache together. I love using gouache. Both of these paintings are by me. This is right outside the loading dock at UHD. I painted this during Hurricane Harvey because I was just like freaked out. The water was like really literally within a fraction of an inch from coming into my house. Like I'm sure like many people were not that lucky. It was scary. I know if you lived here, you know it. Sometimes watercolors used in combination with gouache, and Albert Dürer, he did that a lot. So when he's using like really transparent areas, he's using watercolor, but when he goes back in with the darker details, he used gouache in his pieces. Again, you have to use heavy paper or it's gonna, when it gets wet, paper buckles. So you have to use super duper heavy paper. So the next kind of painting medium is acrylic paint, which is fairly new. Like all those other ones have been invented years ago, and acrylic paint, people didn't start using it until I think around the 20s or 30s. So acrylic paint is plastic resin that you mix it with water and pigments, and once it's dry. It was initially developed for automobiles, and then it was embraced by the Los Tres Grandes, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco. And so they all were Mexican muralists. And they painted these big murals. A lot of times the murals would be outside. And initially they used oil paint. Well, the problem with oil paint is when the wind blows or dirt flies up, it gets in the paint. And the problem with oil paint is it takes forever to dry. So they were just like, oh God, we hate oil paint. And then they heard about acrylic and they started using it on their amazing murals because it dried more quickly, and therefore you eliminated some of the problem of having dirt and crap flying to it. So here's a amazing Diego Rivera mural that he did the whole series on the history of Mexico. And then here's a Orozco, and here's a, like these are both by him, and Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros were, especially Orozco and Siqueiros, were painters during the Mexican Revolution. Rivera was over studying art in Europe while this was going on, and then he came back and he would do paintings in support of the working man and indigenous people's rights. Here's Siqueiros. And then somebody else that used acrylic, house paint in his paintings was Jackson Pollock, and he'd been a pupil of Siqueiros, and he worked with Grant Wood. And what he started noticing there, so they're painting these murals on the wall and the paint's dripping, and he becomes really fascinated with the drips of the paint. And then that translates into these paintings, which sell for millions of dollars, but which I've never developed a taste for. And then a local muralist, and I have a really great interview video with him, is Daniel Angulu, and he also goes by the name of Wea. And you've seen his murals all over the city of Houston. He's great. I love Daniel. And then finally, we're going to talk about an art form called combines that these are mixed media works that combine painting, sculpture, printmaking, or other media. And the word was combined by an artist. He's originally from Port Arthur, and then he moved to New York in the 40s or 50s, and he coined the word. This is a piece of his called Monogram, and I talk about it in the chapter. And I'm just going to leave it here. And next class, we're going to, if you're in my summer school class, and if you're not, ignore this. But the next summer school class, we're going to talk about the fine art medium of sculpture. Have a good afternoon, and see you soon. If I can only get this to, oh my God, come on, close. Just, you could turn the video off now. I'm having trouble getting it to, oh my God, come on. It's not letting me, jeez. Okay, ha, goodbye everyone. Finally, shut up, Miss